The world has always laughed at Mr. Bean. But the man behind the rubber face, the battered mini, and the beloved teddy bear has finally, at the age of 70, said out loud what many people quietly suspected for years. Rowan Atkinson does not particularly like being Mr. Bean. He never really did. And now, with a brand new Netflix show climbing to #1 globally, a 4th season of the animated series in production, and a string of candid interviews that have pulled back the curtain on one of comedy's most private figures, the full and complicated picture of Rowan Atkinson is coming into sharper focus than ever before. January 6, 2025 marked Rowan Sebastian Atkinson's 70th birthday. He was born in a small town in County Durham, England, the youngest of 4 boys. The milestone sparked an enormous wave of affection online. Fans posted their favorite clips, tributes flooded social media, and news outlets published lengthy retrospectives celebrating a man who had spent nearly 5 decades making people laugh without ever quite appearing to enjoy the process. The birthday also reignited a question that has followed Atkinson for years. What does the future hold for one of Britain's most iconic entertainers? The answer, as 2025 unfolded, turned out to be far more active and revealing than most people expected. The year opened with a candid interview in which Atkinson made headlines around the world by openly addressing his complicated relationship with his most famous character. He admitted that he does not enjoy playing Mr. Bean, calling the role stressful and exhausting, and said he looks forward to the end whenever he is filming it. The weight of responsibility is not pleasant, he said, adding that the experience drains him in ways that his other work never has. For millions of fans who had assumed that performing as Mr. Bean must be among the greatest joys of his professional life, the revelation was genuinely startling. It was not entirely new territory. Atkinson had hinted at these feelings before in various interviews over the decades, but the directness with which he addressed it at 70 carried a different weight. This was not a comedian deflecting with humor or downplaying his feelings for the sake of public relations. This was a man who had spent half a century carrying the expectations of the world on his rubbery shoulders, and who was finally being entirely honest about what that had cost him. Atkinson has described the character as entirely selfish and self-centered, a child in a grown man's body, and acknowledged that while he can understand why audiences love that, he himself would never want Mr. Bean in his house. What made the confession even more layered was the context in which it arrived. Because even as Atkinson was being frank about the burden of Mr. Bean, he was also actively returning to screens with work that drew on exactly the same style of physical, near-silent comedy that had made the character so beloved. Netflix confirmed that Man vs. Baby, the follow-up to Atkinson's 2022 comedy Man vs. Bee, would premiere on December 11, 2025. The new series consisted of 4 episodes, each approximately 30 minutes long. It was the continuation of a creative partnership with Netflix that had given Atkinson something he had always said he wanted, a format flexible enough to let him work at his own pace, in his own way, without the crushing pressure of sustaining a character that the entire world had already decided was sacred. Man vs. Baby found Atkinson reprising his role as Trevor Bingley, a hapless caretaker who, on the last day of his job at a school, finds himself unexpectedly responsible for an infant left behind from the nativity play. With money tight, family plans in disarray, and Christmas approaching, Trevor takes a lucrative house-sitting job at a luxurious London penthouse, Baby in tow. The premise was deliberately simple, the kind of setup that anyone anywhere in the world could follow without needing to understand a single word of English dialogue, and the kind of comedy that had always been Atkinson's greatest strength. The response was extraordinary. Man vs. Baby claimed the #1 spot on Netflix's global charts in more than 70 countries, including the United States, an achievement made all the more remarkable by the fact that it was directly competing with the debut of Stranger Things Season 5, Netflix's biggest English-language TV launch ever. A comedian who had just turned 70 and who openly admitted to finding physical comedy increasingly difficult had somehow managed to outperform one of the most anticipated television events in years. It said everything about the enduring power of Atkinson's particular brand of humor. At a London screening of the show, Atkinson expanded on his relationship with Mr. Bean, describing the character as a selfish, self-serving, anarchic child. He added that while he would never want to have dinner with Mr. Bean, he does understand the character's appeal, connecting it to a kind of childish eccentricity he recognized in himself at the age of 10. It was a kind of quietly honest remark that rarely comes from celebrities, and it deepened the portrait of a man who had always been more thoughtful and self-aware than his most famous creation suggested. Critics were divided on the new show. Man vs. Baby received a 71% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, with the UK Times awarding it 4 out of 5 stars and praising Atkinson's physical performance as a powerhouse display of rubbery facial expressions and extraordinary physicality. The Guardian was less impressed, giving it 2 out of 5. But what critics thought had never been the measure Atkinson chose to rely on. He explained in interviews that he had not read a single review or critical assessment of any project he had worked on since the 20th century ended. His only metric was whether people wanted to watch, and whether they would want to see more. By that standard, the show was an unqualified triumph. The series leaned heavily into the physical language that Atkinson had spent a lifetime perfecting. Ordinary domestic spaces transformed into arenas of quiet danger. Everyday objects becoming obstacles. Small mistakes compounding into disasters. His timing, reviewers noted, remained exceptional. The craftsmanship behind the physical comedy was evident even to those who felt the material was too familiar. For an actor who claimed to find this style of work exhausting, he made it look effortless in a way that no one else alive quite manages to do. Alongside the new Netflix project, 2025 also brought confirmation that the animated version of Mr. Bean would continue. A 4th season of Mr. Bean, the animated series, was announced, consisting of 52 new episodes, with Rowan Atkinson returning to voice the character. The series would air on Cartoonito, HBO Max, ITVX Kids, and other platforms globally. The animated format had always given Atkinson a version of a character he could live with. He could provide the voice without enduring the physical toll of performing the role in full body. It was the compromise that had allowed Mr. Bean to continue reaching new generations of fans while giving the man who created him a measure of relief. The scale of Mr. Bean's ongoing global reach is genuinely difficult to comprehend. The official YouTube channel had surpassed 12 billion views and 35 million subscribers, numbers that place it among the most watched entertainment channels on the planet. The character had been sold to more than 190 countries. Comedy schools had begun teaching what they called the Atkinson method, studying the principles of physical, silent comedy that he had developed. People around the world who had never heard of Blackadder, who had no idea what Not the 9 O'Clock News was, who had never seen 4 Weddings and a Funeral, knew exactly who Mr. Bean was the moment they saw his face. And yet the man behind that face had spent the better part of a decade quietly trying to articulate the cost of all that success. Atkinson had spoken in earlier years about the anxiety that had accompanied his career from its earliest days, about the perfectionism that had driven him and drained him simultaneously. He had talked about the stutter that plagued his childhood and that vanished only when he stepped into a character, about the years of rejection from the BBC before Not the 9 O'Clock News finally gave him a platform, about the way that playing Mr. Bean had always felt like carrying a weight rather than enjoying a gift. What 2025 revealed was that Atkinson, at 70, had found a version of his working life that seemed more sustainable and perhaps more honest than anything he had managed before. The Netflix collaboration allowed him to create on his own terms. The animated series allowed Mr. Bean to live on without demanding everything from him physically. And the candid interviews about his true feelings toward his most famous role had given the public a more complete and human portrait of a man they thought they already knew. One reviewer, reflecting on the new Netflix series, wrote that after decades on screen, Atkinson remains a force of nature, and that his presence elevates any project he touches regardless of whether the material reaches the heights of his greatest work. That assessment captured something important. The question of whether Man vs. Baby was as good as Mr. Bean or Blackadder was beside the point. The fact that Rowan Atkinson was still working, still performing, still capable of claiming the #1 spot on a global streaming platform at the age of 70, while simultaneously being more honest about his creative struggles than he had ever been before. That was the story. He had spent his career hiding in plain sight. The most physically expressive comedian of his generation had always been, beneath the faces and the silence, a deeply private and self-critical person. The boy who stuttered so badly that classmates mocked him had grown into a man who found his voice only by disappearing into characters. And now, at 70, he had finally done the one thing that Mr. Bean could never do. He had simply told the truth. He found the role exhausting. He found it stressful. He loved what it had given to the world, and he was not entirely sure he would miss performing it himself. For an audience that had spent decades laughing at a man they never quite understood, that honesty was its own kind of gift. Mr. Bean had always been funny because he refused to show the world how he was really feeling. Rowan Atkinson, it turned out, had been doing much the same thing for years. At 70, that had finally changed. And somehow, the truth was even more compelling than the comedy.